Oh hi! See, I told you I'd be back, and in this video I'm gonna tell you all about the second theater piece that I made, which is called Who We Are, or Wie we zijn in Dutch. I'm gonna try and divide it into parts or chapters. I don't know what the young and hip people call it these days. So if you don't find a certain part interesting, you can skip to a later part. Alright, let's get started!
Kijk, dit is weer een vraag waar het onmogelijk is om een antwoord op te geven.
Het is makkelijk om daar meewarig over te doen. Ik denk dat we wel voorzichtig mee moeten zijn.
Identiteit, ik weet het eigenlijk niet.
Oh hi! Hi, remember me? So before we get started, maybe just some general information about this piece. It's called Who We Are, or Wie we zijn in Dutch, and it's focused mostly on identity and how that is formed, but it also starts from a very personal story that I try to then sort of expand a little bit and make a little bit more universal and get out of that, just that personal context like I did with the first piece. However, this piece I did not make entirely on my own. I got to make it together with a theater company, Het Nieuwstedelijk in Leuven, and they had this wonderful opportunity for me to be a young artist in residence for about a year, which was amazing. I think we ended up doing about 9 months. They were just an amazing team that I could count on for every aspect of this process. They would be there for the technical part, the production part, even some artistic feedback. I could always sit with one of the dramaturgs or other creators and talk about what I wanted to do or what I wanted to talk about, and sort of just test things out or just discuss them with them. That was just really amazing to have. It's also a great opportunity to be a full-time artistic employee for that long of a period, because that's usually not how it works in Belgium. You usually work with daily contracts as a artistic freelancer, which is very nerve-wracking sometimes, because it's a very unstable job position to be in. But this was just an amazing opportunity, and it was such a great time for me to explore things and sort of try things out. There's a musician called Bert Hornix who often makes the music for a lot of their pieces, who also made the music for this piece, and he just made amazing music. We discussed the style and the feel of it, and he was often present during rehearsals, and then he would write something new and we would try it out, and he was just amazing. I did bring in the sonographer that I had worked with previously for the Wat Niet Weg Is, or That Which Is Not Gone production, because at that time I couldn't really afford him, and he did it as a sort of friend service favor to me, because we both worked for the same theater company called Berlin, which is a very different theater company than Het Nieuwstedelijk. I should make a video about them as well, because they're really cool, and they're the group that I started out with, and the sort of the place where I took my first steps into the professional theater world. So different video about that maybe sometime. But back to Het Nieuwstedelijk, I brought in Manu as sonographer for this piece as well, and he just created this really cool setting, I think, which is basically a huge screen and then a bunch of little screens in front, and those different screens have several purposes. They reference the sort of fragmented nature of identity, but they also refer to, from afar, it could also resemble a computer chip, a microchip, which is something that comes back later in the story that I really liked. And it also gave me the opportunity to place you see the 7 screens. It gave me the opportunity to give 7 different experts a voice in this story, and use the back screen, the huge screen, as the backdrop for the entire story, in which you see a journey road movie, basically. Alright, so now that you know the basic setup of this piece and what it looks like on a stage, it's meant for a larger audience, not the same as with That Which Is Not Gone or What Need to Wake is my first theater piece, which was only for 7 people at a time. This one is clearly for a larger audience, even though I do prefer small groups of people. I've played it a couple of times for larger groups, which, to give you an idea, because maybe you're thinking crazy amounts, but I'm talking about 250 to 300 people, which is already a large group, and that works a little bit less for me because I do think that this kind of storytelling or theater pieces really require a kind of intimate connection, and that's easier to have when it's a small group of people. So I do prefer that. I prefer around 75 people in the audience. I know that sounds maybe lame, I don't know. Now that you know all of that, I'm gonna tell you what I wrote about and what this piece was about mostly. I'm gonna divide it into a couple of different blocks. If you find one of them not so interesting, you can just skip that, or you can skip right ahead to the end where I talk about what happened to the footage that you guys sent in that I asked for to use in this performance piece. That's gonna be at the end. But first, let me tell you what it was about. The first thing I'll start with is the personal story, which is something that I usually start from in order to make something. I start with a personal experience because I've discovered that for a lot of people that's the most relatable part and it draws them into a story. And for me, this one was gonna be about my grandparents on my mother's side. So my grandfather on my mother's side used to be a pilot with the Belgian army, and he had his training in the US. My grandmother is now in a retirement home here in Belgium. She has dementia. My grandmother is a big character throughout the whole thing. However, the dementia is sort of a subtle theme and not a very big focus point. But it does factor into the whole question of how much of our identity is formed by our memories, and can you really still have an identity if you have no recollections anymore? So that is sort of a question that is raised in there, but it's a vague thing, and the focus, I think, is mostly on them as a couple and their history. My grandfather had to flee the country during the war, and together with his dad and his sister, he left to seek refuge in England. And when he was brought back after a couple of years, he was brought back in a Lancaster plane together with his older brother. And they were sitting in the nose of that plane, and his older brother said, "This is what I want to be when I grow up. I want to be a pilot." And my grandfather just sort of followed in his footsteps and became a pilot. And that fate was sort of decided in that plane, which I think is just a beautiful and strange and also tragic thing. And then when he came back, he met my grandmother, who had stayed in Belgium during the war, and they became a couple. And my grandmother's father had, so my great-grandfather, he had pigeons all his life. He would enter them in competitions, and my grandmother has this thing with birds, which I think it's sort of a very poetic thing that she's always been looking at birds since she was little, and it's something she did also her entire life. Ever since I've known her, she would look outside on the patio or into the garden and look at the birds and talk about the birds that she would see. And I think there's sort of a poetic connection between that and then being married to someone who's a pilot and who's often away for long periods of time and who you don't see, but you know, you could see him if you look up. And then I don't know, it's to me there was something poetic in that I really wanted to explore and look into. So that's sort of the starting point, were these people and their histories, but also I start from an even more personal memory, which is me being at their house. I was at their house a lot, especially in my teenage years, because my high school was right around their corner, so I would go there for lunch and I would be there a lot. And at one point, I think I was 9, this was early on, I found a picture in a drawer somewhere or in a box, and it was this picture of what seemed like me in a white dress at, I don't know, some kind of, not a wedding, but like a communion, first communion kind of party. And my cousin actually found the picture, and she was like, "When were you at a communion party or a wedding?" Because we were young, we didn't know what it was. "When were you at a wedding? And this dress is really cool, and why didn't you tell me about it?" And I just stared at the picture for hours because that wasn't me. And I figured I would have had a long-lost twin somewhere. Yeah, okay. Maybe I was watching a little bit too much of Full House and the Olsen twins at that time, but I was very convinced that there was a long-lost twin out there somewhere. Which of course there wasn't. And then my grandmother would tell me that it was my mom and that I look a lot like her. And that just sort of starts the whole discussion of how much of our looks or character is defined by genetics and how much of our identity is shaped by our DNA and how much can we still control ourselves. And that brings us to some experts that I've consulted, which I'll talk about later in the imposter syndrome part of this video. One more aspect in this personal story chapter that brings me to the second chapter, the space chapter, is how my grandfather, who was a pilot during the war, he received military training in the US, and for some reason he was there at the time when they launched the Apollo 10 into space, which wasn't a successful mission. The Apollo 11 was. That was the first one to land on the moon. But he didn't see that one, but he saw the Apollo 10 launch from the, I don't know what you call them, the bleachers that they installed for that event miles away from where it was actually happening, but they could see it live. So he talks about that, and that link to space I thought was really interesting because I wanted to link a couple of other elements, space elements, to this personal story and talk about that. So that brings us to the second chapter. The second theme or big block in this whole performance piece for me was space. And it starts off with my grandfather having seen that Apollo 10 launching, but I link it to another aspect which I find what I thought was really an interesting story was the story of Michael Collins, who was the third astronaut in the first moon landing mission. He's often called the forgotten astronaut because he's overlooked so often in the moon landing mission. When it's discussed, people talk about Armstrong and Aldrin, but they rarely discuss Michael Collins because he wasn't allowed to set foot on the moon. He was the one stuck in the module waiting for his colleagues to come back. And I sort of use that story as it's an anecdote that runs through the performance piece, and in the end, I kind of link my grandmother to him as sort of the forgotten astronaut, the one who stays behind and waits for people to return, which is kind of how I see her position now, as she's in a retirement home and she's just constantly waiting for people to come to her and say hi because she can't go out herself or take part in anything. So she has to live off of the vicarious experiences and just listen to our stories about what's happening out there in the world. Another reason why I looked into the whole space thing was that when I talked about identity, or I asked people about what do you think forms your identity, there's a lot of people around me who, after they graduated, they took a sabbatical and they went on this world traveling journey. And when I asked them why, they would say, because I want to find out who I am, which I think is, to me, it sounds like an odd reason for travel. I mean, I get traveling and wanting to see the world, but doing that in order to find out something about yourself, I'm not sure if that's, I don't really understand that motivation, or I'm not sure if you find out that much about yourself. You do find something out about yourself in specific contexts, but I'm not sure if it teaches you a lot about who you are. But I really did find that idea fascinating, so I wanted to talk to someone who traveled the furthest, and that would be an astronaut. So I went to talk to Frank de Winne, who's a Belgian astronaut who spent a lot of time in space. He was incredibly sweet, and first we talked a little bit about what that was like, and then I asked him what identity meant to him and if he found himself on his way to space. And for him, that was a really beautiful answer. For him, it's just not something that occupies him. He doesn't really think about identity all that much. It's not a thing that he's concerned with. So that was really interesting to hear. And that was just a fun answer to have in that whole discussion, because I've interviewed so many people, and to have just one person go, I'm not really concerned with that. It's not really my thing. I don't think about that, is a fun way out of that whole philosophical discussion. Another space element that is in the show is the story of Paolo Belluta, who's an Italian man who works for NASA. And I had some email correspondence with him for a different project that I worked on for Theater Company Berlin. I emailed him a couple of times about a couple of different space projects, and we ended up talking a lot, and he is one of the drivers who controls the rovers, who controlled Opportunity and Curiosity, the Mars rovers. And we had a nice email correspondence for a long time. And the story of Opportunity, which I thought was a very poetic one and a very emotional one, is something that I really wanted to put into this performance piece. So I talk about that as like an anecdote of, discussing with Paolo, who drove these rovers for so long, and then Opportunity suddenly dying on him. The last message that Opportunity sent was, my battery's low and it's getting dark, which to me had this very poetic vibe to it. And of course, to Paolo is just a very factual message. The battery was getting low when it was getting dark. And then after a while, they did decide to pull the plug on Opportunity. They had hoped for a while that the dust would blow off in February, March, because that's the wind season on Mars. But that didn't happen, and so they lost all contact with Oppie, and he called her Oppie instead of Opportunity, which I loved. It's just such a cute way to refer to these rovers and give them a personality also. But he talked about Oppie as, it was this huge loss, and people were really sad, people were brought to tears. And the weeks prior to pulling the plug, they were playing songs in the team to boost morale. And then when they finally had to pull the plug, they sent, the Billie Holiday song up into space, where she sings, "I'll find you in the morning sun, and when the night is new, I'll be looking at the moon, but I'll be seeing you." And it's just such an emotional thing. I thought it was a really sad story, but Paolo, he said, more than missing that rover, I'll be missing Mars, because for me, it feels like I've lived on Mars for 15 years, and I'm gonna miss seeing that view every day. I'm gonna miss walking around and just being there. And then that kind of raises the whole question for me in the discussion about identity, in the discussion about digital identity. When is something real? Can you really travel to a place without having been there? And for me, it's possible. I mean, when Paolo says that he's lived on Mars for 15 years, I agree. Like, he's been there for 15 years, and it's just such a big part of his life that I know that he'll miss it. And then he concludes sort of with, worse than missing Mars would be to miss the memory of Mars, would be to not be able to think back of it and know what it was like. And that brings us back to the whole dementia aspect, and what does memory define, and does it define who you are? Does it contribute to your identity? And of course, there's a lot to be said about that. A lot to be said about when you don't have any memories, and then what is your identity based on? And are you still the same person? That's maybe a different discussion altogether, but that's a huge part of what this performance piece, this theater piece was about for me, I think. And then there's one last space element that I'm going to link to in the last part, the imposter syndrome part of this video, because it's all linked together, and hopefully you'll see the bridges between all these items without having seen the piece. So the last part, the imposter syndrome part, is something that I really wanted to talk about, and that's a big part for me of this piece, and it's also something that I struggle with. The imposter syndrome, for those of you who haven't heard of it yet, it's not really a syndrome. It's kind of labeled wrongly. It's not an actual syndrome. It's a feeling that about 70% of people get at one point or other, which is a feeling that they're going to be exposed as a fraud or an imposter, and that they're not actually capable of doing all the things that people think they are capable of. And it also means that you're going to ascribe all your successes to luck and coincidence and timing and just pretty much anything external. So for me, it was a big discovery that this had a name and that it was a thing and that other people had it, because I struggle with that a lot. One of the people that I interviewed, a psychology professor, I think he explained it as a sort of dissonance that occurs between this thing that other people think you are and you not being able to see that as an inherent part of who you are. So there's some kind of dissonance that occurs there. I'm not sure due to what. There's a couple of TED Talks on it if you want to look at it. I was just relieved to see that a lot of people experience the same issue. I think some studies show that a lot of those people are women, are educated women, but I'm pretty sure it occurs everywhere. The people that I talked to while making this theater piece and the people that I explained the imposter syndrome to, even if they were like bank directors or CEOs, pretty much everyone answered, oh yeah, I have that. So it's this huge fear of somehow being exposed, or people one day figuring out that, hey, you don't belong here. You're not really capable of the job that you're doing. And how did you even get here? And it's not just a professional thing. Some people even have it as, a mother. They feel like on the playground that other mothers will expose them as, hey, you're not really a mother. You don't really know how to do this. So that's a big thing, apparently, that a lot of people have, that I really wanted to do something with in this theater piece. And I tried to do that by doing two things. The first thing I did was interview a ton of experts, different kinds of experts that seem to have no relation to each other or the story, but then eventually do. There was a robot maker who made really cool robots that sort of have a social critique in them. One of the robots is called Rachel. She goes on tour with me when I play this piece. She's on stage and basically her eyes and her eyebrows move, and that's all she does. People automatically attribute meaning to that. And the second thing is that people often ask, what else can she do? Because there's this high expectation of robots have to do more than that, and why is she a robot and she can't do cool things? Like, it's a bit of a critique on that. He's a really cool guy, by the way. You should definitely check out his work. Another expert I interviewed was a digital expert who wrote a book called Artificial Stupidity, and he talks about how this digital age also shapes us and how we should navigate these digital times. Then there's a philosophy professor, a psychology professor, a Zen Buddhist, a bird expert, relating to my grandmother who watches the birds and my grandfather who was a pilot. And then there's a biologist who's also a genealogist and talks about DNA research and what our genes tell us about who we are. And then there's the astronaut, Frank de Winne, who I mentioned in the previous chapter, a Belgian astronaut who spent a lot of time in space. So those are the different voices that I feature on these tiny little screens on the stage. Second way in which I tried to incorporate the imposter syndrome in this piece was by opening each chapter. I have different chapters in the piece, and I start each chapter with a quote by a philosopher or a scientist or this really impressive person. And then in the end, spoiler alert, I confess that all of these quotes are made up. It's a trick that I sort of came up with, which was inspired by a mentor of mine who said that she did that. It's a trick where you write down a sentence and you think it's a horrible sentence and you're not a writer because you're an imposter as a writer. But then you write down a different name next to the sentence and see if you can rediscover the value of it, or maybe think that it now does have value because someone else said it. If it's not you, then it might have some value. So it's just a little trick that I used, and it was a fun little twist for the piece, because for an hour and a half people were hearing these quotes by these famous philosophers, and it tricks them into sometimes thinking, well, if this person said it, then it must be true. And that was kind of the point of not trusting your own knowledge or instincts or writing even. So that was a little trick. Write down a sentence, put down a different name, and then later revisit it. And if you think that, that it looks fine and it sounds good and it sounds true and insightful or whatever, then you get to keep it. And a final thing in this imposter syndrome part or theme in the performance piece is a Neil Gaiman anecdote. You probably all know Neil Gaiman as an author, but he has a Tumblr page, and a fan asked him a question, said, I struggle with the imposter syndrome, what should I do with that? And Neil Gaiman replied, with one, read this book, that helped me, and two, he replied with an anecdote. So Neil Gaiman tells this anecdote of when he was at a conference with scientists and writers and really impressive people, and he was wondering how he fit in, and on day 3 he was standing in a hall looking at this entire lecture hall filled with impressive people, and this old man came up next to him, and his name was also Neil, and he started talking to him. And in the middle of the conversation, the old man says, "If I look around at all these amazing people, I wonder what I'm doing here, because I just went where they sent me." And so he looks at the old man and he says, "But Neil, you were the first man on the moon. That's got to count for something, right?" And that just really struck me. If even Neil Armstrong is struggling with the imposter syndrome, then I'm sure we all are at one point, and it's not that bad. And it also links back to the space element, and that's why I really wanted to include that in the performance piece. Short interruption here, and yes, I look different. It's a different recording because while editing, I realized that both the microphone that's on top of this camera and this one both went crazy at the same time. Who knows why? That's the weird mystery of life. But now I can't use the rest of that video, and I was just getting to the end. I think both the camera and the microphone were just like, it's been taking a little bit too long. You're probably tired of it already, but I'm gonna skip right to the end and tell you the very last element of this performance piece. The last element of this performance piece is a quote, an actual quote, not a made-up quote, by a man named Lewis. And Lewis is actually a theater technician that I met while touring with the first piece, with That Which Is Not Gone, or Wat Niet Weg Is. And in this story, in Wie We Zijn, or Who We Are, I sort of made him to a different character. I made him into someone I met at a gas station because that fit the story a little bit better, as the whole thing was sort of a journey, and you could see the road behind me, this big screen. So anyway, Lewis is a man who in reality was a theater technician, and he actually went to see That Which Is Not Gone when I was playing where he was working, and afterwards we had a discussion about it. Because Dutch is not his native language, I asked him if everything was clear or not too fast, and if he was able to follow it well. And we got into a whole discussion and conversation about language, which was really interesting. And he told me something that I then wanted to use for this performance piece. He said that back in Mexico, he was an anthropologist and he did a lot of research. And he did research with a tribe that today we would call a primitive tribe. But he said they had a very nice custom when they would see each other on the streets. They wouldn't just ask each other how they were, but they would say, "Tlen kitowa moyolo," which he translated as, "What does the heart say?" And I thought that was really, really beautiful, and I really wanted to use that in the text. And I asked him, because I studied literature and linguistics, I was very interested in dissecting that sentence or question, and I asked him what each word meant, and he said "tlen" means what, kitowa comes from the verb to say, and moyolo, that's the heart. And I wanted to dissect that even further, so I said, is moyo heart, and is lo, does that mean your? And he said, no, there's no your, it's the heart, because the heart is not yours. And it sounded really poetic and maybe a little bit spiritual, but it's none of that. It's actually, it has to do with language and frame of reference, and he said in for that tribe, the heart is part of the universe, much like you are part of the universe. So they talk about things differently, and they don't use possessive pronouns. So that was a really beautiful encounter that I wanted to put in this performance piece, and I ended up using that quote, "Tlen kitowa moyolo," and crediting Lewis for that, and using that as an anecdote in the end, as a conclusive anecdote where, you meet someone and you talk about what does the heart say, and after only an hour or two of talking, you finally get to what's your name and where you're from, and sort of basic things that we consider to be very key or crucial parts to who we are or what our identity is. And I thought that was really interesting. So I use that sentence, that beautiful phrase, to get to the end, and in the conclusion I drive back to my grandmother, who's in the retirement home, and we have a long talk about how she is and the travels that she remembers, and I tell her about my journey and how I went to talk to so many people about identity, and I talk about the biologist and the philosopher and the psychologist, and And I also remember that one sentence that the biologist said, which also sounded very spiritual and sort of, I don't know, esoteric, I guess, but it's factual, you know. At one point he's such a grounded, level-headed person, and at one point he goes, yeah, you know, we're stardust, that's basically all we are. And that really stuck with me, and it kind of made me think of how you oftentimes you want to go back to where you came from and find your roots or find your origins. And so that was sort of a very silly bridge to signing up for the launch of the new Mars rover. I don't know if you followed that, but for a while you could sign your name up and then it would be engraved, I think, in a microchip that would be placed on top of the new rover that they were going to send to Mars, the one that has landed meanwhile. So that for me was sort of, you know, doing what my grandfather did, being in the nose of the plane or on front of the rover that's going to Mars and going back to space, stardust to stardust, I guess, was sort of a thing. And then the piece sort of concludes with my grandmother, who's a little bit confused and asks me what place she loved most. And we both realize that she means home, because she loved being home the most. But because we've been talking about the traveling, I just respond, Cuba. And she smiles, this very reassuring but sort of a I know what we're doing here smile, and she responds, yes, that's it, Cuba. And so that's the end of that piece. And there you go, that's the entire piece without really having seen it. Now you know most of what happens in that piece. And I hope that wasn't too boring. I mean, the microphone and this microphone both gave up on me. So if you haven't, then you're a wonderful person. Thank you so much. I hope you found it a little bit interesting. And now the piece that you might have been wondering about, what happened to the footage that you guys sent me that I was going to include in this performance piece? I did actually include it. I made a little montage, and the idea was to talk about digital identity and also talk about all these different voices from different countries, different places, who then say something about what identity means to them. That was the idea in the digital chapter of the piece. We rehearsed it a couple of times and it actually looked pretty cool, and I was really happy to have you guys on set with me. There were a couple of you who sent me a video that I could use, and I was really happy with that because you guys did a great job and it was so fun to have you with me. But after a couple of rehearsals, a few months in, we realized that the piece was getting too long. It was about 2 hours long, which is pretty long for what's basically a monologue with video in it, and we had to cut so much stuff. I think we cut about half an hour, which I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but it really is quite a lot, especially when it's just you talking and other people talking. Then it's a lot of material that is cut, basically the length of this video, I guess. So that's a lot, right? And we had to make the decision to cut the digital part of the digital part. So the digital chapter is still a chapter, it's just a lot shorter. So yeah, I ended up not using it, which is really sad, and I really miss you guys on stage with me when I'm performing it. But in the whole of the thing and the process and the story, it seems like the right decision, and I think we just had to do that. And the piece is a little bit more accessible because of it, and concise, I guess, even though it's an hour and a half, so not really that short. But still, thanks so much for sending me those videos, because it was a really important part of constructing the piece, and up until the very end you guys were with me, and that was really, really fun. So thanks for that. Basically, you know everything there is to know about this piece if you've watched this video. If you want to read the text, it's only available in Dutch, and it's published in a little book that's published by the Nieuw Toneelbibliotheek. There's a link down below in the description box, and you can buy that, but that's only in Dutch. So I'm really sorry that there's no English version of it available, but I think if you watch this video, then you probably know all there is to know about this piece. And also, if you've watched this to the very end, then that's quite a feat, because, you know, both microphones gave up on me and you didn't. So thank you for that. That's really sweet. That's all for today. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you again very soon. You better believe it. See you then. Bye. Peace out.